All right. Uh, so good evening, everybody. So kind of we are restarting the session after 2 or 3 weeks. So thanks for making it up. So the plan for today, I think, kind of continue the conversation from where we left off. Although it would be another introduction to the introduction to set the stage to kind of see which direction we want to take the study to under the larger structure of theological frameworks, right? So that was the kind of the logical step segue from our study from the last 2 years. So now that we have come into the dive deeper part of the theology frameworks, so we've been kind of setting the stage for the last 2 or 3 weeks and then kind of see which direction will be the best way for us to continue, right? That's what I think we've been checking the pulse or finding our way out. So that is one of the reasons I was trying to slice this from different vantage points. So as you might recall, last 2 or 3 weeks ago, I gave an introduction about setting the stage of in a survey format by laying out all the theology frameworks available or taught in the seminaries, right? So I just kind of took a survey approach. The advantage of that approach is not picking one approach versus the other. The two larger frameworks I'm sure you all know is covenantalism and dispensationalism. So without kind of choosing this versus the other, we thought we will take a kind of a survey approach and kind of list out the features or the underpinnings of each and every one of those theology frameworks, and then kind of see how it will help us to study the scripture. That was the kind of the starting point. As part of the process, it just kind of a personal kind of a reflection standpoint, it just dawned on me that type of a slicing fits perfectly into our larger study, the sovereign blueprint study. After all, we kind of realized the sovereign way of looking at the theology or scripture is a superset. In other words, the covenantalism and dispensationalism are two sides of the same coin called sovereignty, right? That's a kind of the revelation or kind of a thing I kind of discerned. So to drive home that point, I kind of put a structure around it and then try to present a point of view how covenantalism and dispensationalism fits within this, what I call integrated sovereignism. So that's kind of the context. So just to do a little bit of a quick recap, what we did last week, I'm going to quickly run through those slides so that you know what we covered, because it has been 2 or 3 weeks. And then we can make a segue into today's study, right? That's the way I'm setting the stage. As you might recall, we took a kind of the answer to question why we need a dynamic framework like sovereign blueprint-based theology framework covering both covenantalism and dispensationalism, because this is an approach which helps us to model scriptural sovereign reality as accurately as possible. So to answer that question, obviously we kind of first started with listing all the 4 popular theology frameworks: the classic covenantalism, progressive covenantalism, similarly classic dispensationalism, and progressive dispensationalism, right? So that's kind of the 4 different popular frameworks. And then we try to put them into a kind of a quadrant format. We kind of started from all the worldviews. We kind of placed all the popular worldviews into this quadrant. I don't want to go into the detail, but then just want you to kind of, for this part of a recap, we put that Judeo-Christian worldview, Judaism, and Islam, and all the other worldviews. And then with the same quadrant, we kind of put the 4 popular frameworks into this quadrant. Just I'm giving you a little bit of a recap, and then we proved a point. Integrated sovereignism is an amalgamation or a superset of all the 4 approaches. That's the way I kind of structured it. So with that, I think that introduction kind of gave us a point. I think, it's kind of an open-ended kind of a framing, because with that framing, we could kind of pivot into a lot of different ways. Either we thought we will go and study with this lens, answering the 3 questions which are answered by all the survey approach. Like, if you look at all the kind of the popular covenantalism or dispensationalism, some of the books written on those frameworks, they all kind of take a structured approach of answering those 3 questions we talked about. How covenants have evolved. And similarly, if you look at the 3 questions, they are in the bottom portion of the screen. And similarly, how dispensations have evolved from Israel to church, and then how doctrines are interpreted. This is the, by and large, 3 questions every one of the books written on this theology frameworks answer. So we thought we can kind of take the same approach, answer the same 3 types of question, but with the integrated sovereignism approach. That was the kind of the context we set the stage a couple of weeks ago. So then, as I thought about it after that, I think now as we are continuing into the study, again, I thought we are not quite ready to start answering those 3 questions yet. We will kind of get there maybe in the next, to say, 1 or 2 or 3 weeks, depending upon how this introduction kind of fits in, and then we can logically move into those 3 questions. But before that, as I thought about it for today, since we are still in setting the stage or kind of giving an introduction to introduction, maybe it might make sense to answer this question, which will give us a little bit more clarity of what exactly we are trying to study, so that we will all understand when we go into those 3 questions, it'll make sense. We can answer them in a much bigger context. That's the kind of the idea I'm trying to answer this question for today. And with the hope it will make you to think a little bit more, and then we can go into those 3 questions in the coming weeks. So this kind of the question here is, as we alluded in the last session, if covenantalism and dispensationalism are 2 sides of the same coin called sovereignty, why not study scripture using a sovereignty lens, so that we can kind of strike 2 birds with the same one stone, so to speak? In other words, the idea is, if we study with this lens, we can kind of study both covenantalism and dispensationalism side by side. That is the idea. So the question is, this is an uncharted territory. So we are going to derive a lot of the thinking from both the frameworks, because by no means I'm a theologian, right? We are, again, by the nature of this Bible studies, and this is an experimental Bible study. So the idea here is we are going to derive a lot of the thinking from all the theologians, both from the covenantalism side and dispensationalism side, and then see how it stacks up within the context of sovereignty, God, our sovereign blueprint. That is what we are trying to accomplish. By no means we are going to reinvent any one of those existing theology or doctrines or any one of those thinking. So that's one thing I just want to make sure we are very clear on that. So that said, so the question we might kind of ask is, okay, we are kind of study this, both covenantalism and dispensationalism in a survey approach. The question one might ask is, this is in a way kind of continues from the same question we kind of asked in the last session. Why do we have to study scripture in a structured approach? We go to church, we hear sermons, we are all kind of being practicing Christians, we do sacraments and everything else, right? They all teach scripture. But the question is, why do we have to study in a structured approach? as opposed to what we learn from your Sunday schools and from your churches. So in a way, this is a kind of the question they teach or they answer in a seminary to an extent. So I think it might make sense to ask that question so that we can understand, we can be really sure what exactly we are trying to kind of study using this Bible study. The best verse to start I think, is Isaiah 44:7. Again, you might have run into this verse, but again, for me, when I ran into this verse just maybe say 2 or 3 weeks ago, it resonated with me in a much powerful way. As I dive deeper, especially when I do a little bit of a Hebrew root analysis, it has got 5 different steps, which in a way tells me, it kind of looks to me, this verse perfectly summarizes what God is asking every one of us to do. Obviously, the 5 steps, as you can see, the establishing the sovereign model. If you look at the whole verse, right, I think this basically talks about step by way. God is saying, what I established from the ancient days, okay, you guys are supposed to do, come back and declare, lay out, proclaim, and foretell. So the idea here is God has already established it end to end sovereign blueprint, right? That is the foundation of our Judeo-Christian worldview faith. God is sovereign, and he has established that when God said, let there be light, everything from end to end was already predestined, right? So the idea what God is challenging us to do is, you guys go and figure it out so that you can use the insights, or you can study and apply them to make wise choices, actions as per my will within that blueprint. That is as simple as that. So that is one reason why we need to study scripture in a structured way, so that we can, as much as possible, we can try to make choices, decisions in every day, every walk of our life, as per the sovereign blueprint. I know we have already talked about navigating sovereign blueprint and everything else, but the idea here is, when we take this structured approach, this will help us to do those things as much as possible as per the sovereign blueprint. And if I have to go a step further, especially prophets, all the prophets, when they prophesy, when those books are written, they are all slice of the sovereign blueprint. What they did, especially what they were doing, is they were doing step number 5. So in other words, the idea is God has established us, and then we are supposed to go through the declare, lay out, proclaim, and foretell. Once you do all those steps properly, we will be able to make wise choices or action as per God's sovereign will. That is the objective. That's the reason we have to go through a structured approach. Hopefully that makes it clear. And then if I have to go a step further, especially in a marketplace context, and most of us are coming from the business side of the house or tech side of the world, to think about prophets like Daniel and Joseph, especially Daniel, I'm 100% convinced he should have done exactly this, especially up to step number 5. That was the reason he was able to interpret not only the dream, but also the interpretation. So again, does that mean all of us can become like Daniel? But the question is, but maybe not. That is, God has chosen you as one of the chosen vessels. The grace was given for him to get more visibility. But the idea is, it is possible for everybody. But then when you go through a structured approach like this, it'll help us to go a step closer towards that purpose, so that it not only studying the scripture for the sake of scripture, but also it'll help us to excel in the marketplace, to face the challenges in the marketplace. That is the another kind of the byproduct of the structured approach. Hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit of a kind of the context and answer the question, why do we need to study scripture in a structured approach? So that's it. So before we try to kind of answer the next question, okay, or even maybe I can say, how do we say covenantalism and dispensationalism are 2 sides of the same coin? Okay, can you prove it to an extent, right? So if you can kind of, I just want to make sure, not a proof for the sake of proving, but I just want to kind of internalize the point. When they say covenantalism and dispensationalism are two sides of the same coin, what do I mean by that? Okay, so that's what I think I want to kind of establish the context and make you to understand it, so that you all can be really convinced this is one of the best ways to study scripture. Again, by no means this is the one, I'm not saying this is the best way to do it. This is one of the better ways to do it. That's the way I'm looking at it, because we are still looking at it with a survey mindset. That means we are kind of comparing and contrast, kind of trying to frame this as a superset approach. So that said, first some kind of a definitions. So I'm sure we all might have run into this definition, covenantalism. What is covenantalism versus dispensationalism, right? So just for setting the stage of definitions, I just wanted to kind of define them in a kind of a comparative language, so that you can kind of understand what exactly it means in one or two sentences, right? So again, this is not a comprehensive definition, but just the kind of the key word I want you to focus here is covenantalism is studying the scripture using contextual interpretation based covenantal law lens. That's the key. I think, this is basically the idea here is every one of the scriptural passages have to be interpreted as per the context. So that is very key. And then you have to look at through the covenantal law lens. I think that is the primary point. Again, there are a lot of other hermeneutics. There are a lot more details. I want you to look into it and study it, but this is the kind of the key message I want you to understand. Similarly, on the flip side, dispensationalism, studying the scripture comparatively, I'm not saying it is literal interpretation basing dispensational grace lens. So just the kind of the context, one is contextual interpretation using covenant, another one is literal interpretation using dispensational grace lens. Okay, so with that definition, the hypothesis here is we are to study scripture, covenantal laws, in a dispensational appropriate way as per sovereign will of God. Because covenantalism and dispensationalism are two sides of the same coin called sovereignty. In other words, if we are convinced, okay, the definition of covenantalism is contextual interpretation, dispensationalism is literal interpretation. If we can kind of prove a point, they are two sides of the same coin, then we can say both interpretations have a time and place for it. This question is, we got to study them in a dispensational appropriate way as per sovereign will of God. Or in other words, you have to study covenants and dispensation in a sovereign appropriate way. So that's a point I am trying to make. So to establish it, what I'm going to do is just to kind of help you to understand how this covenantalism and dispensationalism evolved from sovereign blueprint standpoint. Again, remember, sovereign blueprint was already established end to end. But in God's sovereign will, he revealed them to mankind in a step-by-step as per the consciousness shaping of humanity. In other words, God's revelation to mankind evolved depending upon indirectly proportional to how human consciousness evolved. So if you can understand the point, the revelation was happening in a step-by-step manner. So in other words, to understand the grace, dispensational part of the grace, God had to go through certain step-by-step approach to understand, to prepare your consciousness in a way so that you are in a mature stage to understand grace. So that was the kind of the context. Yes, God had designed it end to end, but then he was going through a step-by-step process. So he had to go through a covenantal law step before revealing his dispensational grace. So once you grasp that point, then it is easy to understand covenantalism and dispensationalism are two sides of the same coin called sovereignty, because they are all part of the sovereign plan. God had designed to reveal covenants as a first step before for your consciousness to grasp the grace point. To drive home this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of take some examples from how secular disciplines have evolved. Okay, this kind of step-by-step approach evolved from some secular disciplines, and then compare and contrast back to theology. Again, if you look at that, this is from the kind of this is one of the inspiration you all of us, you already have some visibility of our metaphorical interpretation of grace to gravity. We all know the context, and so all of you are aware of it. I want you to just focus on the just the left side of the astronomy piece, the energy cosmology and space-time cosmology. Okay, just for a moment, just focus on the definitions here. The energy cosmology is studying astronomy using energy density lens-based calculations. Okay. Similarly, the space-time cosmology is studying astronomy using space-time curvature lens-based calculation. Now, if you look at that, I think when just forward, this kind of a thinking has been evolving for the last, say, 2,000, 5,000 years in the astronomy. But 100 years ago, when Einstein was trying to form this relativity theory, okay, what he did was he connected those two dots. Okay, he connected energy cosmology back to space-time cosmology. But if you look at his revelation thinking, okay, to understand the space-time curvature part of the astronomy, you need to have sufficient knowledge on the energy cosmology. In other words, the energy cosmology underpinnings, formulas, the energy calculation, force, power, the Newtonian gravitational physics, all the teachings, all the theories, which has helped us to calculate the energy density for the last, say, 2,000, 3,000 years, were the prerequisite before for us to understand the space-time cosmology. So that was the reason Einstein was able to connect the dots between energy density back to space-time curvature, and he formed the theory of relativity. In other words, if you look at the formula here, the energy formulas were prerequisite for us to understand the gravity, the space-time curvature part of the gravity formulas. If you think about that, the space-time curvature left-hand side of the equation is space-time curvature cosmology, and the right-hand time is the energy cosmology. Okay. So if you can grasp that point, even in the human worldly discipline, the knowledge evolution, okay, the right-hand side of the equation, the energy formulas were the prerequisite step-by-step revelation, which is needed before for our mind, our consciousness to grasp space-time curvature. Now that we have established that point side by side, I want you to look at the theology part of it. Covenantalism, again, similar to energy cosmology, studying scripture using contextual covenant law lens-based interpretation. Similarly, dispensationalism, like space-time cosmology, is looking at it using literal dispensational grace. So now that you can compare and contrast, okay, this is one of the reasons, if you look at that, exactly the space-time curvature equivalent to energy cosmology, we had created our consciousness equation, spirit-soul curvature equal to body consciousness laws. This is something way back we had established. This is what we kind of call that as a quorum DO equation or individual consciousness equation. We already know. So the takeaway, if you look at that here, is the spirit, soul, curvature, grace equal to body consciousness laws, right? If you can understand the point, the takeaway, my point I'm saying is the covenantalism is the right-hand side of the view. Dispensationalism is the left-hand side of the view. Hope it makes it clear. I think I've kind of laid out step by step. If you can grasp that point, God in his sovereign wisdom and as per his sovereign blueprint, he had to first teach covenantalism in a step-by-step manner before teaching us dispensationalism. So that's the reason I'm saying both covenantalism and dispensationalism are two sides of the same coin called sovereignty of God. If I need to prove that point a little more further, if you go back to the foundational equation, the equation below, the green box, that is what our integrated sovereign equation, you might recall. It has got 5 different components. This is the kind of the predestination blueprint for the whole universe, right? You might recall. And then the first part, the individual consciousness equation, is what the same thing what we derived before. The point I'm saying is, if you look at this 5-part equation, the covenantalism helps us to condition livers 1 to 3, okay, which is coming from the right-hand side, which is mean the covenantalism view of study helps us to condition or strengthen liver 1, 2, 3, whereas dispensationalism helps us to strengthen liver 4 and of course 5. So then they are all kind of circularly, iteratively fed back to the equation, you have the integral equation. So in other words, for us to fulfill sovereign will of God, you need to have both views. Granted, sometimes, a lot of times, we can say without covenantalism, we cannot understand the value or grasp the importance of grace. So the point again is, if you look at from this equation standpoint, you need to have both views, because covenantalism strengthens the liver first 1 to 3, and the dispensationalism strengthens the remaining 2 livers. Collectively, they all work together to fulfill God's sovereign plan. I think, again, this is a little bit of a mathematical way of proving why God had to reveal his revelation in a step-by-step manner, so that his ultimate purpose is for us to understand his sovereign blueprint, so that we will study and understand it and fulfill his will in our life. That is the ultimate purpose. So God was going through a step-by-step way of first taking a covenantalism approach before teaching the grace. Again, I can talk about this point from multiple different ways. Paul talks about this point again a lot in Romans, if you might recall, because that was his clear argument why law was needed for grace. And again, I know you all are very familiar with Paul's arguments from Romans, but I thought if you can come from the science and math background and give you a complementary viewpoint, okay, so that it'll kind of resonate with you why these two viewpoints are two sides of the same coin. So we are better off studying scripture using an approach like this approach called integrated sovereignism. Again, by this no means, this is a superset approach. That means both the thinking are needed. We got to pick and choose, okay, start from covenantalism, learn from it, and then understand the dispensational grace part of it, and then put them all together within this 5-part sovereign equation mindset, then everything will fit together. That's kind of my point. Hopefully, if you can grasp that point, okay, then you'll understand the value in studying scripture using this integrated sovereignism framework. hopefully you're with me so far. Again, I know we have covered a lot of deeper points. Maybe we've got another 10 or 15 minutes, so we can open up the floor a little bit and see. And again, I'm trying my best to come from different vantage points to make you to think, right? So see, the purpose again for this introduction to introduction sessions are to make you to think, so that it will all help you before we dive deeper into those three questions. That's what I'm trying to do. So that said, I kind of wanted to put that in a kind of a quick pictorial format, right? So how does that all fits in? So this is a kind of my attempt to show this 5-part equation in action. So how this individual, collective, and cumulative part of our consciousness revolves around within sovereign blueprint. So again, this is something we will go in detail in one of the next when we are studying those detailed questions. But I thought this will be a good schematic for you to understand how our consciousness has evolved. See, remember I talked about human consciousness has been evolving depending upon the evolvement God was teaching. So the point again is, God was teaching humanity how first the covenantalism part and then before teaching grace. Similarly, even when we are born into this world, okay, even personally, for us to understand grace, we need to have an understanding of covenantalism and laws. So that is the kind of the greener concentric circles kind of evolving, if you can see the picture, and then where we are in. And the idea here is we are supposed to navigate in our unique path as per the purpose path within the sovereign blueprint. As you can see that, again, I want you to look at that. We will kind of go into this picture maybe in a little more detail when we're asking some of the detailed questions like how do you discover will of God and everything. I think the idea here is I kind of put that in a pictorial format just to help you to see what exactly I'm talking about, especially when you talk about the individual and cumulative consciousness, right? So when I say individual, it is easy to see the circle, but when I say cumulative consciousness, it is all integral functions of all the past cycles. Hope you can see that. That is what makes this equational part more complex. Again, the idea is not to solve it, but for you to visually see how this 5-part equation has been derived 100% accurately using mathematical construct and the relativity construct. Okay, so the idea is for you to kind of connect the dots, but not to mathematically solve it. So that's kind of the, again, I thought I'll just quickly show it to you, but again, we will dive deeper into detail depending upon your interest in one of the future sessions also. That said, if I have to kind of summarize it, so the idea here is the integrated sovereignism is the best way of interpreting, applying scripture, scripture's covenantal laws in a dispensational appropriate way as per the sovereign will of God, in a way in both degree of space-time simultaneously as per the will of God. Again, this is the kind of the, if I have to kind of summarize the top 3 reasons, this is the ultimate superset model. We already talked about it. And then sovereignty of God is the source of all realities. Again, we saw scripture is a slice of sovereign blueprint. And then finally, when Jeremiah in 31:33, and God says you got to inscribe scripture in our hearts, this is one of the best ways to inscribe scripture as opposed to memorizing it. So again, this is another point of view. This way we can remember when to pull, how to connect the dots. The idea finally to in closing is, when you think about it, all prophets, especially as I talked about it before, Daniel and Joseph must have done this exactly this steps mentally in their spirit and soul before interpreting those difficult dreams in the marketplaces. This is the reason what we are trying to do is if you can institutionalize it in the form of a structured approach and democratize it so that everybody can do it. It is as simple as that. That's objective. In other words, this study is to train the trainer, as I have been always saying. In other words, this type of thinking approach has to go into the masses so that everybody should be able to do it. That is the purpose of God. So that's what we are trying to do, this train the trainer, so that we can institutionalize this type of thinking and approach so that everybody can do this, so that they can all do the things as per the sovereign will of God and fulfill their life purpose. That is idea. Hopefully that kind of makes it clear why we have